Robert Williams stepped onto his front porch at 7:43 in the morning with a mug of coffee in his hand and stopped. The road in front of his house was buried under black hoods and chrome grills, and the low growl of engines that had never once turned down a dirt road in their lives. Black Escalades, silver Bentleys, a Rolls-Royce, the color of gunmetal, parked directly across from his mailbox. His
Oh
neighbor,
wow, look
Ray
at this
Cutler,
lineup. The red one
stood
is
in his
pure
yard in a
fire,
bathrobe,
and the gray so
phone
sleek, but the
raised,
blue is
mouth
calling my
open.
name today.
Joshua
It's okay, buddy.
appeared at
Are you
Robert's
sure?
hip,
Yes, I
blinking
promise.
at the road
Okay.
in pajamas. Then one of the front doors opened. A woman stepped down from the lead vehicle. She wore a red dress, fitted, sleek, the kind of red that didn't apologize for itself, and a cream-white coat over her shoulders. Her heels struck the dirt road with the deliberate sound of someone who had never adjusted her pace for terrain. The handbag on her arm was white, structured, and worth more than Robert's truck. Her hair, dark gold, fell loose past her shoulders. Her face was the kind of face that made Ray Cutler forget he was holding a phone. She walked straight across the road and stopped in front of Robert. He looked at her.
I
looked
need the
again.
truth from you.
There was nothing
This
familiar in the
sculpture
line of her
captures a
jaw,
sense of freedom.
the
It's
set of her
mesmerizing.
eyes,
What draws
the
you to
way
it?
she held herself.
Listen to me.
I'm sorry.
We don't have
Have we
much
met?
time. The
The
situation is...
woman tilted her head slightly. I came to find you. You forgot me that fast? Last night, you were the one who let me into your house. Robert's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the convoy of cars, looked back at her. Nothing connected. Joshua tugged his father's shirt. Dad, who is she? Robert shook his head. I have no idea, buddy. To understand how a woman like Elizabeth Jones ended up on a dirt road in Clover Ridge, Tennessee at 11:17 on a Tuesday night with a dead GPS and 8% battery left on her phone, you had to go back to the night before, to the rain, and to the choice she made when everything else ran out. It started with her father. Thomas Anderson had pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand the morning she left Chicago, his grip firmer than she expected from a man who had spent the last 2 months losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. His handwriting had written 3 things: Clover Ridge, Tennessee, Robert Williams. Find him, Elizabeth. He's the only one left. She hadn't taken a driver, hadn't told Kenneth. She pulled out of the Ashby Capitol parking garage at 2 in the afternoon in a rented sedan and drove south into weather that got worse with every hour. By the time she crossed into Tennessee, the rain was arriving in heavy horizontal sheets the wipers couldn't keep up with. The GPS lost signal somewhere past a town called Fairview. Her phone was down to 8%. She turned off the highway where she thought the map had told her to turn. The road narrowed. Then it narrowed again. Then it became a channel of dark mud hemmed in by trees, and her front tires sank into it with a soft final sound she felt before she heard it. She sat with the engine off and the rain hammering the roof. Elizabeth Jones, chief executive of a $2.4 billion company, sat in the dark in a ditch in rural Tennessee and did not know what to do next. That was the part she would not tell anyone. Then she saw the light, one window 200 yards off through the trees, yellow and faint. She pulled her coat up, opened the door into the rain, and ran. The porch light was on. She knocked. The man who opened the door was tall, with dark eyes and the build of someone who worked with his hands. In the dim yellow light and the heavy curtain of rain, he could not see her clearly. She was soaked through, her hair flat against her face. "My car got stuck. I need to wait out the rain." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He did not ask her name. He stepped back and held the door open. He brought her dry clothes, pointed her to the small bedroom at the end of the hall, and said he and his son would be fine on the couch. He said it matter-of-factly, and then he walked away. She lay down on the narrow bed, just for a moment to wait, and was asleep in minutes. She woke before 5. She found an outlet in the hallway, charged her phone to 11%, called Kenneth. Then she folded the clothes the man had lent her and placed them on the bed, corners even. She pulled the front door shut behind her as carefully as she could. The boy found the empty bedroom first. He stood in the doorway and looked at the folded pile on the bed. She left. His father looked at the clothes, the folded edges, the corners pulled neat. Looks like it. Back on the porch, in the morning light, and the impossible presence of 40-some luxury vehicles idling on his dirt road, Robert was still trying to make the pieces fit. The woman in front of him mentioned the clothes. She said they had been left folded on the bed, and that she was sorry she hadn't had a way to say thank you at the time. Something in Robert shifted. Not recognition of her face, which he had never really seen, but recognition of the thing she was describing. The folded clothes, the quiet exit, the careful way of someone who didn't want to be a burden. That was you. It wasn't quite a question. She held out her hand, and her voice shifted into something practiced and clear. A register she had used 1,000 times at board meetings and industry conferences from Chicago to Zurich. Elizabeth Jones, CEO of Ashby Medical Devices out of Chicago. The man beside her, 50s, gray suit, the slightly frantic look of someone who had spent the night on the phone, stepped forward and extended a business card. Robert took it without looking at it. He was looking at her, at the name, Jones. He had heard that name in a very different context, in a very different life. He had been 31 years old, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from a conference center in Boston, talking to a man in his late 50s who had ordered black coffee and asked him questions about intracranial pressure mapping that none of his colleagues at the conference had known enough to ask. They had talked for 3 hours. The man had been sharp in a way Robert respected, not the sharpness of someone performing intelligence, but the real thing earned over decades. His name had been Thomas Anderson. Robert remembered him clearly, the way he leaned forward when a point became interesting, the way he wrote nothing down but missed nothing, the way he had asked at the end of those 3 hours whether Robert had considered what he would do. When the techniques he was developing outpaced the institutional willingness to support them, Robert had thought about that question for years afterward. He looked at the woman in front of him, at the shape of her face. There was something in the eyes, the directness, the refusal to flinch, that was familiar in a way that had nothing to do with last night. She was still talking. She was telling him she was on her way to find someone, a physician her father had asked her to find, that she had been following an address when she'd run into the storm, that she still needed to keep looking, that her team would compensate him for the trouble of last night. "Who are you looking for?" Robert's voice was quiet. Beside him, Joshua looked up at his father. Elizabeth paused. She said the name the way you say a name you've been carrying for weeks carefully. It's like something breakable. A physician. He specialized in neurosurgery. His name is Robert Williams. My father knew him a long time ago. He says he's the only one who can help. Joshua looked at his father. Robert's expression did not change. He looked at Elizabeth Jones for a moment, and then at the road full of cars, and then he looked back at her. "Come inside. I'll put on more coffee." He turned and walked back into the house without waiting to see if she would follow. She did. Kenneth followed her, already reaching for his phone. Ray Cutler, still standing in his bathrobe across the street, watched the whole convoy of vehicles settle into idle and took 16 photographs. Inside the small kitchen, with the morning light coming through the window over the sink, and the coffee maker running, and Kenneth sitting rigidly on a wooden chair that was not built for a man, wearing a suit that cost what it cost. Elizabeth told him everything. Her father, Thomas Anderson, was sick. A brain tumor situated in a location that made conventional surgical approaches extraordinarily dangerous. The best neurosurgeons in Chicago had reviewed the case, then specialists from New York, then 2 physicians flown in from Germany, men who had between them operated on more than 300 similar cases. All of them had said the same thing. The tumor was inoperable. The location, the density, the proximity to critical neural pathways. To go in was to risk leaving her father with no language, no memory, or no life at all. The prognosis without intervention was 3 to 6 months. Thomas had listened to every one of them. He had thanked them, and then, one evening, he had asked Elizabeth to sit with him and told her about a conversation he'd had 12 years ago in a coffee shop in Boston. He remembered the young doctor clearly. Robert Williams had been, in Thomas's words, the most quietly extraordinary physician he had ever met, not because of his credentials, but because of the way he thought, the questions he asked, the way he described the brain as something to be understood before it was touched. Thomas had walked away from that conversation believing that if he ever faced something the others couldn't handle, Robert Williams was the name he would call. But Robert Williams had disappeared. Not gradually, not with a forwarding address. He had simply stopped. No active medical license, no hospital affiliations, no record of professional activity after a certain date. The private investigator Elizabeth had hired found a Nashville apartment vacated 8 years ago and a car registered to a Clover Ridge address in a DMV record from 3 years back. That was the trail. That was all of it. The man has vanished. Elizabeth was looking at Robert directly, the way she always looked at people she was speaking to fully, without reservation. No one has been able to find him. Robert was looking at his coffee cup. Joshua, eating cereal at the end of the table, had gone still. In the particular way children go still when they understand more than the adults in the room have said. Robert set the cup down slowly. "What address were you going to when you got stuck last night?" Elizabeth reached into her coat and took out a piece of paper, folded twice. The creases worn, the handwriting in the slightly uneven print of a man whose hands had been shaking when he wrote it. She read out the address. Robert recognized it without effort. It was the apartment he had left 8 years ago when he left Nashville. When he left everything. He did not say this. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window at his yard, where his truck sat with a cracked taillight he hadn't gotten around to fixing. Joshua watched his father's face with the quiet precision of a child who has learned to read it. Elizabeth was watching him, too, in the particular way that intelligent people understand things before they have all the evidence. Not through logic, but through the quality of someone's silence. She was beginning to understand that she had found what she was looking for. She looked at Robert Williams, sitting across the kitchen table at the work round hands, wrapped around the coffee cup. Oz, at the quiet that lived into Chosen's. And since then forgotten he had chosen, and she understood, without being able to say precisely Hethai had not been wrong, that the address on her father's paper had not been wrong. She had just been looking for the wrong version of the man. She stood up from the table and followed Kenneth toward the hallway, meaning to give him a file he'd been asking about since they'd arrived. The door to the room at the end of the hall was open. The room she'd slept in the night before, and she was almost past it when something on the wall of the adjacent room caught her eye. She stopped. The room was used for storage: cardboard boxes, a toolbox, a broken lamp that had been waiting to be thrown away. But on the wall above a narrow desk in a dark wood frame that had been placed there, and then apparently forgotten, was a diploma. The glass had a thin film of dust on it. The paper behind it was still bright. Doctor of Medicine, Neurosurgery and General Surgery, the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, awarded to Robert James Williams. Elizabeth stood very still. She looked at the diploma for a long moment. She looked at the name. She looked through the doorway toward the kitchen, where she could see the back of a man in a work shirt, standing at the sink, rinsing his coffee cup with the unhurried ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. An electrician's truck sat in the driveway. Tools on the counter, a child's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets. This was who he had become, not a reduction of what he had been, something else entirely, something chosen. You. Her voice came out different than it usually did. Quieter, stripped of its professional register, the board meeting polish she'd been carrying since she learned to walk into a room. Just the word and the breath behind it. You're him. Robert turned off the faucet. He dried his hands on a dish towel. He turned around and looked at her, standing in the doorway. I don't practice anymore. 4 words, level as a table. She stepped into the kitchen. My father is dying. She didn't say it like a plea. She didn't say it like a tactic, the way she sometimes deployed informations, precisely, and for effective in negotiations. She said it, the way you say a thing that is simply true and that you've been carrying for a long time without putting it down because there has been nowhere to put it. Robert looked at her, not the way he had looked at her on the porch, trying to place her face, not through the blur of this morning's confusion. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are actually seeing them. The tension at the corners of her eyes, the set of her jaw that was working very hard to stay set, the hands that were not quite loose at her side. And Elizabeth looked at him not as a CEO looks at a resource to be acquired, not as a desperate daughter looks at her last option. She looked at him the way you look at someone who is standing on the same side of something as you, even if neither of you asked to be there. From the doorway at the end of the hall, Joshua appeared. He looked at both of them, at his father's stillness, at the woman's face, and then quietly turned and went back the way he came. That afternoon, after Kenneth had stepped outside to make calls, and Joshua had retreated upstairs, Robert sat across from Elizabeth at the kitchen table and told her about Linda. He didn't plan to. It wasn't Elizabeth's question that started it. She hadn't asked, not directly. It was Joshua who had come downstairs to return a library book and found an old photograph on the counter, one Robert had left there weeks ago when sorting through a box and hadn't managed to put away. Joshua set it on the table without understanding what he was carrying, then went back upstairs. The photograph showed a younger version of Robert in a white coat, smiling in the unguarded way he almost never smiled now. Beside him was a woman, blonde. Her head tilted toward his, laughing at something outside the frame. She had the kind of face that was easy to read from across the room. Elizabeth didn't ask, but she didn't look away. Linda had been 34 years old. She had been on her way home from her sister's house on a Thursday evening in March when a truck ran a red light at a wet intersection. The call came into Vanderbilt Medical Center at 8:47. By the time the name on the intake form resolved into the woman it belonged to, Robert was already moving. He operated on her himself. There was no one else that night with his level of experience with the specific type of intracranial hemorrhage she had sustained. He scrubbed in because the alternative was to stand in the hallway and wait while someone with less experience worked on his wife, and he could not do that. He did everything correctly, every decision, every technique, every response to every complication. He was the best surgeon in the building that night. It had not been enough. Linda died at 12:19. He stopped after that. Not gradually, he stopped the way a machine stops when you cut the power. He took a leave that became a resignation, left the Nashville apartment because every room in it still had her in it, and drove south until he stopped moving in Clover Ridge, a small town where no one knew his name, and there was a school within walking distance for Joshua. He had been a good doctor. He still knew that. But every time he tried to imagine standing over an operating table again, to imagine looking down at someone's open skull, the lights above him, the instruments in his hands, he saw Linda's face, and his hands would not cooperate. He told Elizabeth this quietly without emphasis. When he stopped, the kitchen was very still. Outside, the October wind moved through the yard. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "My father didn't tell me to find you because you were the best on paper. He said you were the only doctor he ever met who looked at a patient like a person, not a case, not a problem, a person. He said the conversation you two had in Boston was one of the clearest things he remembered from that decade. He said you talked about the brain like it was something worth protecting." Robert didn't answer, but for the first time since Elizabeth had walked up his porch steps, he pulled out a chair and sat down at his own table, not standing, not keeping the careful distance of someone who hasn't decided, yet sitting across from her. Outside, Kenneth stood in the yard with his phone and did not come back in. Elizabeth laid out what she was asking simply and without ornamentation, because it was not a speech. She had prepared so much as a fact she had been living with for months. She needed him to come to Chicago to review her father's case, to look at the scans, the surgical assessments, the notes from 4 different specialist teams, and tell her if there was anything the other physicians had missed, anything the imaging showed that no one had been willing to act on. She was not asking him to promise an outcome. She was not asking him to decide right now whether he would operate. She was asking him to look. That was all, just to look. Robert said he couldn't. His medical license had lapsed, not revoked, never that. Just out to expire by a man who had not expected to need it again. He had no current hospital privileges. He hadn't touched a patient's chart in years. He laid these out not defensively, but simply the way you lay out facts that are just facts. Elizabeth pushed. She did it the way she pushed in board meetings, not with volume, but with precision. She outlined the options available under Illinois medical consultations statutes. She told him the ASHP Center had a credentialing pathway for emergency C consultants, that she had already spoken with their legal team, that it could be arranged within 48 hours. She told him she would handle every logistical obstacle, and that money was not a constraint and had never been the point. Robert listened to all of it. He let her finish. Then, he said what he had been saying all along, but with a different weight behind it now, the weight of someone who had already decided and was only waiting for the right way to say it. Money isn't the problem. Kenneth tried a different approach, framing it as a records review, technically advisory, not requiring active licensure. He had rehearsed it. You could hear the rehearsal in the phrasing. Robert looked at him steadily. You know that's not what this is. Kenneth stopped talking. The kitchen went quiet. Elizabeth had reached the edge what of logic and resources and professional persistence could accomplish. She had pressed as far as that territory extended, and she was standing at its border. Then Joshua came downstairs. He had been listening from the landing, not sneaking, just present in the way children are when they've decided something is important. He came to his father's side, put his hand on Robert's arm, and said quietly enough that Elizabeth could hear every word, "Dad, if someone's dad is sick, you help. That's what you always tell me." Robert looked at his son for a long stretch. Something moved through his face that was not quite any of the things Elizabeth had seen there before. Not the measured stillness, not the professional detachment he had been maintaining since the moment she stepped off that lead car. Something that was just him. Then he looked at Elizabeth. I'll review the files, all of them. If I look at everything and I don't see anything that changes the picture, I go home and we don't discuss this further. That's the deal. Elizabeth said it without hesitation, without qualification, without looking at Kenneth to check if it was reasonable. She just said it. Yes. There was a beat of silence in the small kitchen. The coffee maker had finished its cycle. The yard outside the window was still. The 40-some vehicles on the dirt road had gone quiet, as if they were waiting too. Robert stood up from the table and went to the hallway to get his coat. They flew to Chicago that evening. Robert wore the only suit he owned, charcoal gray, bought for a funeral, worn only once since. Joshua stayed in Clover Ridge with Gloria, who arrived at the house within 40 minutes of Robert's call, already carrying a casserole dish and asking no questions that weren't necessary. The convoy pulled away from the dirt road just after 6. Ray Cutler watched from his porch and took 4 more photographs. Elizabeth sat in the back of the lead car, with Robert beside her. Kenneth sat up front, speaking quietly into his phone, arranging things that needed arranging. Robert looked out the window at the Tennessee hills, going dark under the October. He had not been on a plane in 8 years. He had not worn this suit in 8 years. He had not thought seriously about the inside of an operating room in 8 years, and now he was doing all three at once because an 8-year-old boy had reminded him of something he had been pretending to forget, which was that some things matter more than the reasons you have for not doing them. The plane lifted off from Nashville just after 8. Elizabeth did not speak. Kenneth worked on his laptop. Robert sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the city fall away beneath them, the grid of lights spreading out in all directions, and thought about the last time he had flown, which had been to a conference in Denver where he was supposed to present findings on a technique he's developing for accessing posterior fossa tumors through a modified retrosigmoid approach. Linda had driven him to the airport. She had kissed him at the curb and told him to knock them dead. He had presented the paper. He had fielded questions. He had been offered a position at a research hospital in California. He had turned it down because Linda's family was in Nashville, and he was not going to ask her to leave. 3 weeks later, she was dead, and none of it had mattered. The research, the technique, the careful trajectory of a career built one decision at a time. All of it had stopped mattering the moment the nurse had looked at him across the operating table and said the words he already knew were coming because he could see it in the monitors, in the numbers that were no longer numbers, but a countdown to the end of everything that had made sense. He had walked out of that operating room and kept walking. Out of the hospital, out of the profession, out of the life he had built. And he had not looked back because looking back required him to reconcile the man who had saved dozens of lives with the man who could not save the one that mattered most. And he did not know how to do that. But now he was on a plane to Chicago because a woman he had sheltered from the rain had turned out to be someone looking for him, and her father was dying. And his son had reminded him that sometimes the answer to whether you help is just yes. The plane banked over Lake Michigan. The city came into view, a sprawl of light and geometry and motion that looked from this height like something you could hold in your hand. Elizabeth looked out the window beside him. "Thank you for coming." Robert didn't answer right away. Then he said what he had been thinking since the moment Joshua had put his hand on his arm in the kitchen. "I haven't promised you anything yet." "I know." The plane descended. The wheels touched down. They taxied to the gate, and Kenneth was already on his phone before the seatbelt sign turned off. Elizabeth gathered her things with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Robert stood and reached for the overhead bin and felt the weight of the suit jacket settle onto his shoulders and remembered what it felt like to be a doctor, which was not the same as being a surgeon and not the same as being the man who had walked away 8 years ago, but something in between that he did not have a name for yet. They walked through the terminal. Kenneth led the way. Elizabeth walked beside Robert. No one spoke. Outside, a car was waiting. They drove through the city in silence. The buildings rose around them, glass and steel catching the lights of other buildings. The whole mechanism of a city that never stopped moving, even when the people inside it needed it to. Robert looked out the window and thought about Thomas Anderson, about the man who had asked Thomas Anderson's. The man asked him questions in a coffee shop 12 years ago about the sharpness in his eyes and the way he had leaned forward when the conversation got interesting. He wondered if that sharpness was still there, or if the tumor had taken it, or if the fear of what was coming had dulled it into something else. The car pulled up in front of a building on North Michigan Avenue. Ashby Medical Center occupied the upper 4 floors. They rode the elevator in silence. The doors opened onto a hallway that smelled like hospital smell, antiseptic, and the faint trace of something no amount of cleaning ever fully removes. Kenneth led them to a corner suite on the top floor. The door was open. Elizabeth stopped just outside it, and Robert understood, without needing to be told, that she was giving him a moment to decide if he was ready, which was a kindness he had not expected and did not know what to do with. He stepped through the door. The room had windows looking out over the city in 3 directions, the kind of quiet that comes from very good soundproofing and a great deal of money. And in the bed, propped against pillows in a way that suggested effort, was Thomas Anderson. He was thinner than the photographs Robert had seen in news profile. The tremor in his hands was visible from across the room. But his eyes were the same eyes Robert remembered from the coffee shop in Boston, sharp, present, the eyes of a man who had not stopped paying attention. Thomas looked at Robert for a long stretch, and then he smiled, faint but real. "I knew you'd come. I just didn't know Elizabeth would find you quite like that." A pause, something that might have been amusement. "She doesn't do anything the normal way." Elizabeth, standing in the corner, said nothing. Robert pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat. "I'm going to read everything. All the imaging, all the notes, all the operative assessments. I'm not making any promises. I'm just going to read." Thomas nodded. "That's all I'm asking." The files were 412 pages thick. Robert sat beside the bed and read. An hour passed. 2 hours. Elizabeth stood outside the room. Kenneth brought her coffee she didn't drink. The nursing staff moved in and out quietly, and Robert sat still and turned pages. The imaging told a story in shades of gray. CT scans from 3 months ago, when Thomas had first noticed the tremor in his left hand, dismissed it as stress, then noticed it again 2 weeks later when it hadn't stopped. MRI sequences from Chicago showing the mass in cross-section, axial cuts every 3 millimeters, the tumor appearing as a brightness against the darker tissue. Follow-up scans from New York, where a specialist had requested thinner slices, 1.5 millimeters, trying to map the margins with greater precision. Robert studied each one. He noted the location deep in the left temporal lobe, the proximity to Wernicke's area, the way the mass pressed the structures responsible for language comprehension. He read the radiologist's reports, the measured language of findings and impressions, the careful avoidance like hopeless or terminal, the preference for phrases like significant challenges, and unfavorable risk profile. The surgical assessments were more direct. The Chicago team had written 14 pages, concluding that any attempt at resection carried a 70% chance of permanent aphasia and a 40% chance the patient would not survive the procedure. The New York team had been briefer. 8 pages, same conclusion. The 2 German physicians had been the most thorough, 26 pages of analysis, including 3-dimensional reconstructions and probability modeling, and their conclusion had been the most emphatic: operative intervention not advised. Robert read it all. He cross-referenced the imaging with the assessments, traced the logic of each team's reasoning, understood exactly why they had arrived where they had. They were not wrong. The tumor was in a location that made conventional approaches extraordinarily dangerous. The standard lateral approach would require retracting too much healthy tissue. The superior approach would risk the motor strip. The inferior approach would encounter the carotid artery. Every pathway had been evaluated. Every pathway had been closed. But Robert kept reading because Thomas Anderson had not asked him to confirm what 4 teams had already concluded. He had asked him to look, which meant looking at what was there, not what everyone agreed was not there. He went back to the MRI films. He had Kenneth bring them into the room and set up the light box on the wall. He spread the sequences across it, multiple series, different weightings. T1, with and without contrast. T2, flare, diffusion-weighted imaging. The tumor was visible in all of them, a mass the size of a walnut, irregular margins, some enhancements suggesting active growth. Robert stood in front of the light box for 20 minutes without moving. Elizabeth came in once, saw him standing there, and left without speaking. Kenneth checked his watch. Thomas had fallen asleep, his breathing steady, the tremor in his hands continuing even in sleep. Robert's eyes moved across the films, sequence to sequence, slice to slice. He was looking for something he could not name yet, the thing that was there but had not been seen. The asymmetry that would reveal itself only to someone willing to look past what they expected to find. And then he saw it. Not a revelation, not a sudden clarity, just a detail that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. In one of the T2 weighted sequences, taken at a particular angle, with a particular slice thickness, there was a thin line of differentiation along the posterior lateral margin of the tumor. A boundary, faint but present, between the tumor tissue and the adjacent cortex. Every other team had included this sequence in their workup. Every other team had seen this line, but they had read it as artifact, as noise in the signal, as the kind of thing that appears in imaging but means nothing in the operating room. Because anatomy is messier than pictures, and margins that look clean on a screen disappear when you're working with real tissue under real light with real blood obscuring your view. Robert did not think it was artifact. He thought it was exactly what it looked like, which was a plane of separation, narrow but real, that suggested the tumor had not yet fully infiltrated the eloquent cortex the way the other teams believed it had. If that plane existed, if it could be accessed, if a surgeon could work along it with enough precision and enough time, the tumor could be removed without destroying the structures around it. He turned from the light box and looked at Thomas, sleeping in the bed. The man who had asked him 12 years ago what he would do when his techniques outpaced institutional willingness. The man who had believed then that Robert Williams was someone worth remembering. The man who was dying now because 4 teams of excellent surgeons had looked at the same imaging and reached the same conclusion and stopped looking. Robert walked to the door and found Elizabeth in the hallway. She stood when she saw him, her face carefully composed, ready for whatever he was about to say. "I need you to come in." She followed him back into the room. Robert gestured to the light box. "This sequence here, T2 weighted, oblique coronal view. Do you see this line?" Elizabeth looked where he was pointing. She had no neurosurgical training and could not read what he was showing her. With the facility he read it, but she leaned closer, studied the film, tried to see what he was seeing. The thin, darker line along the edge of the bright area. Yes, every assessment treated that as adherent tissue. Full infiltration, no plane of separation. But look at the intensity gradient. Look at the way it maintains continuity across multiple slices. That's not artifact. That's a margin. He traced it with his finger, not touching the film, following the line as it appeared in one slice, disappeared in the next, reappeared 2 slices later. This isn't an inoperable tumor. This is a tumor that no one approached from this angle. The posterior lateral access route is narrow. It requires specific positioning, longer decompression time, and a level of precision that goes beyond standard technique. He paused, his hand still raised toward the film, but the margin is there. Elizabeth was looking at him now, instead of the imaging. She had spent months watching her father decline, months listening to doctors explain why nothing could be done, months carrying the weight of a prognosis that left no room for hope. And now a man who had spent 8 years fixing electrical wiring in rural Tennessee was standing in front of a light box, telling her that everyone else had missed something. What's the difference between can't and won't? Her voice came out different than she had intended, sharper, more challenge than question. Robert turned from the light box and looked at her directly. "I'll do it." 2 words. No qualification, no hedging, no careful language about reviewing options or consulting with colleagues. Just the commitment, clean and final. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, relief, or fear, or both at once. The knowledge that the question she had been carrying for months now had an answer, and the answer meant her father would either live or die on an operating table, and there would be no ambiguity about which. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, and Robert spent the next 30 minutes walking him through what would need to happen. The credentialing would take 48 hours, exactly as Elizabeth had said. The Ashby Center's legal team had already prepared the paperwork for emergency consultant privileges. Robert would need to review the positioning protocols with the anesthesiology team, confirm the availability of specific instruments, run through the approach on a simulator to verify the angles would work with a real body on a real table. Winchester Kenneth wrote it all down, asked clarifying questions, made calls. Within an hour, people were moving. The chief of anesthesiology arrived, a woman in her 50s who listened to Robert, described the positioning requirements, and nodded once, said it was doable, but would require a custom headrest. The ORR coordinator came next, reviewed the instrument list Robert had written on hotel stationery, said most of it was standard, but 2 items would need to be special ordered from a supplier in Boston. Robert worked through it, methodically, the way he had always worked, building the operation in stages, making sure Each piece was in place before moving to the next. Elizabeth watched from the corner of the room. She had spent her career managing complex projects, coordinating teams across time zones, ensuring that intricate processes unfolded according to plan. She recognized what Robert was doing. He was treating her to serve the surgery the way she would treat a product launch, as a series of dependencies that had to be mapped and managed and executed in sequence. But there was something else in the way he worked, something she had not seen. In the executives and consultants she dealt with every day, he was building the operation not just as a technical problem to be solved, but as a thing that would happen to a person, a man who would be unconscious on a table while Robert worked inside his brain, and every decision Robert made carried the weight of that fact. By midnight, the plan was set. Surgery would begin at 7:15, 2 days from now. Robert would have 48 hours to prepare. He spent the first 6 of those hours going through the imaging again. This time with the chief, a man in his 60s who had been reading brain scans since before Robert was born. They went through the sequences slice by slice, and Robert pointed out the margin he had seen, and the radiologist leaned in, adjusted his glasses, looked for a long time, and finally said what Robert needed him to say, which was, "Yes, it's there." The anesthesiology team met at 8 the next morning. Robert described the positioning, the need to flex the neck to open the posterior lateral corridor, the importance of maintaining stable intracranial pressure throughout a procedure that would likely run 9 hours or longer. The chief of anesthesiology asked questions about Robert's experience with this approach, and Robert told it the truth, which was that he had used it twice, both times successfully, both times more than 8 years ago. She considered this, then asked what his backup plan was if the margin turned out not to be as clean as the imaging suggested. Robert walked her through the contingencies, the alternative pathways, the points in the procedure where he would reassess and decide whether to continue or abort. She listened to all of it, and when he was finished, she said she would do it. But she wanted it noted in the chart that she had expressed concern about the elapsed time since his last case. Robert agreed. He understood what she was doing. She was protecting for herself. She was protecting the hospital, making sure that if things went wrong, there would be a record that she had raised the issue. He did not take it personally. It was reasonable caution from someone who did not know him and had no reason to trust that 8 years away had not dulled the skills he was claiming to still possess. He spent the afternoon in the simulation lab working through the approach on a model. The technology had improved since he had last used it. The phantom head responded to pressure, bled when he cut, gave resistance that felt almost real. He worked through the craniotomy, the dural opening, the initial exposure, the microsurgical dissection, along the margin he believed existed. The simulator tracked his movements, recorded his time, flagged moments where his hand position was suboptimal or his angle was off by more than 2 degrees. Robert ran the simulation 4 times. The first took 11 hours. The second took 9.5. The third took 9. The fourth took 8:40, and by the end of it, his hands remembered things his mind had tried to forget. The particular pressure required to separate tissue planes without tearing, the angle at which the microscope light revealed depth, the rhythm of cut and cauterize and irrigate that became automatic after enough repetitions. He left the simulation lab just after 6. His shoulders ached. His eyes burned from the hours under the microscope, but his hands were steady, and the approach was clear in his mind, not as theory, but as movement, as muscle memory, as the thing his body knew how to do, even when his mind was uncertain. Elizabeth found him in the hallway outside the lab. She had a folder in her hand, some document Kenneth needed him to sign, some formality that legal had insisted on. Robert signed without reading it. She stood there for a moment after he handed it back, and she wanted to ask something, but was not sure how. "Are you scared?" The question came out quieter than she had intended. Robert looked at her, at the careful control she was maintaining, at the fear she was working very hard not to show. "Yes, I'll be scared tomorrow. Every time I've been in an OR, I've been scared. The good ones are. But you still do it because someone needs it done." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They stood in the hallway, and neither of them moved, and Robert thought about the night before, about the coffee shop in Boston 12 years ago, about the chain of chances that had led a woman to get stuck in the mud outside his house at exactly the time he would be home to open the door. He did not believe in fate. He believed in probability and proximity, and the 1,000 small choices that add up to a life. But standing in that hallway, he could not shake the feeling that something larger than chance had been at work. That Thomas Anderson asking about him 12 years ago, and Elizabeth getting lost in a storm, and Joshua reminding him what mattered, were all pieces of something he did not have a framework to understand. "Get some rest," he finally said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." She left. Robert went to the room the hospital had provided, a small suite on the 3rd floor, physician housing usually reserved for visiting consultants. He showered, ate the sandwich someone had left on the desk, and tried to sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about Linda, about the last time he had stood over an operating table, about the way her blood pressure had dropped. Despite everything he had done, about the moment he had known it was over and had kept working anyway, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping meant admitting there was nothing left to try. He had not forgiven himself for that night. He knew, intellectually, that there had been nothing more he could have done. The hemorrhage had been catastrophic, the damage too severe, but knowing that did not change the fact that Linda had died while he was holding a scalpel, and for 8 years he had been unable to separate the man who had failed to save his wife from the man who had saved dozens of others, and so he had walked away from all of it, rather than face the question of which man he really was. But tomorrow he would stand in an operating room again. He would hold instruments again. He would open a skull and work inside a brain and make decisions that would determine whether a man lived or died. And the fear that had kept him away for 8 years was still there, but so was the certainty that had made him a surgeon in the first place. The belief that some things were worth the risk of failing, and that walking away was its own kind of failure, quieter, but more permanent. He slept for 3 hours. When he woke, it was still dark outside. He got up, dressed, and went to the cafeteria. The night shift staff were the only people there. Nurses and techs grabbing food between rounds. Robert sat in a corner with black coffee and went through the approach one more time in his mind, visualizing each step, anticipating complications, preparing himself for the moment when theory would become anatomy, and everything would depend on his hands doing what he needed them to do. At 6, he went to the OR floor. The scrub team was already there, setting up instruments, checking the microscope, running through their own checklists. The chief resident, a woman in her early 30s, introduced herself and asked if he wanted to walk through the setup. Robert did. They spent 30 minutes going over the instrument table, the positioning equipment, the backup plans if something broke or failed or did not work the way it was supposed to. At 6:30, Elizabeth arrived. She had been awake all night. He could see it in her face, in the particular exhaustion that comes from not allowing yourself to rest. Because resting feels like giving up. She did not come into the pre-op area. She stood in the hallway and watched through the glass as the team moved around preparing. At 6:55, the anesthesiology team brought Thomas in. He was awake, alert, the tremor in his hands more pronounced than it had been the day before. He saw Robert standing by the table and smiled, faint but real. "You ready for this?" Robert pulled his mask down so Thomas could see his face. "I am if you are." Thomas nodded. The anesthesiologist began the induction sequence. Within 90 seconds, Thomas was unconscious. They positioned him prone, neck flexed, head secured in the custom frame the team had built. Robert scrubbed, gowned, gloved. The room was cold. The lights bright. The instruments laid out in the order he would need them. At 7:14, Robert stepped up to the table. The chief resident stood across from him. The scrub nurse stood to his right. The anesthesiologist at the head of the table called out vitals, blood pressure, 130/80, heart rate, 62, oxygen saturation 99%. At 7:15, Robert picked up the scalpel and began. The incision ran from behind the ear down toward the base of the skull, curving to follow the natural lines of the anatomy. Blood welled up, was suctioned away. The resident retracted skin and muscle, exposing bone. Robert marked the craniotomy, a window 2 inches by 3 inches, positioned to give access to the posterior lateral corridor he had mapped in the imaging. The drill was loud, high-pitched, the smell of bone dust-sharp even through the mask. He worked carefully, thinning the bone until he could lift the flap free, exposing the dura beneath. The dura was tense, pulsing with each heartbeat, the brain beneath it, swollen from the tumor's mass effect. He opened the dura in a curved incision, folding it back, and there was the brain, gray and glistening, the surface vessels pulsing red. He brought the microscope into position, leaned into the eyepieces, and the world narrowed to the small circle of light. The anatomy magnified 20 times, everything else disappearing. He worked slowly, using the microscope instruments, dissect through the arachnoid, identifying landmarks, the veins he needed to preserve, the sulci that would guide him deeper. The chief resident watched, assisted, asked no questions because there were no questions to ask, only the work, one step leading to the next. An hour in, he reached the tumor. It appeared as a difference in color, slightly yellower than the surrounding tissue, firmer to the touch. He worked around its edges, defining the margins, looking for the plane of separation he had seen in the imaging. It was there, faint but present, a line he could follow if he was careful, if he did not rush, if he trusted what he was seeing. 2 hours in, he began the resection. Small pieces at a time, removing tumor tissue, cauterizing bleeding, checking constantly that he was still in the right plane. The anesthesiologist called out vitals every 15 minutes. Blood pressure stable, heart rate stable, no signs of brain swelling. 3 hours in, he encountered the first complication. A small vessel embedded in the tumor wall, feeding the mass but also feeding healthy tissue beyond it. He could not simply cauterize it. He had to trace it, identify where it came from, decide whether it could be sacrificed or needed to be preserved. He worked for 20 minutes on that single vessel, finally deciding to preserve it, routing his dissection around it, accepting the additional time and difficulty rather than risk a stroke. 4 hours in, Joshua called. Elizabeth was in the waiting room, and her phone buzzed, and she stepped into the hallway to answer. Joshua's voice came through, sleepy, worried. "Is my dad in surgery?" Elizabeth looked through the window at the closed doors, at the light above them showing red, occupied. "He's helping my dad. Is he going to be okay?" "I think so. I really think so. He's really good, even if he stopped for a while." "I know." She ended the call and stood in the hallway and realized she was crying, not loudly, just tears running down her face while she stood there, holding her phone. Kenneth appeared with coffee she did not want, and she took it anyway because it gave her something to hold. 5 hours in, Robert had removed roughly half the tumor. The plane was holding. The margins were clean, but the deepest portion remained, the part closest to Wernicke's area, the part where a mistake would mean Thomas, waking up unable to understand language, unable to speak coherently, trapped in a mind that could think but not communicate. Robert paused, pulled back from the microscope, straightened to relieve the pressure on his spine. The scrub nurse handed him water through a straw. He drank, bent back to the microscope, continued. 6 hours in, the anesthesiologist called out a change in vitals. Blood pressure rising, 140/90. Robert acknowledged it, did not stop working. The swelling was expected at this point, the brain reacting to the manipulation, the tissue irritated by hours of dissection. The anesthesiologist gave medication to bring the pressure down. It worked. Vitals stabilized. 7 hours in, Robert reached the deepest part of the tumor. This was the section the other teams had believed inseparable from eloquent cortex. He worked at the edge of visibility, using instruments measured in millimeters, removing tissue in pieces smaller than grains of rice. The resident across from him had stopped assisting, was just watching, because at this level of precision, 2 people working was worse than 1. 8 hours in, Robert saw the end. The final attachment, the last piece of tumor still connected to surrounding tissue. He worked along it, separating, cauterizing, irrigating, until finally, definitively, the tumor was free. He lifted it out, placed it in the specimen container the scrub nurse held ready. The cavity left behind was raw, oozing, but clean. He spent the next hour achieving hemostasis, stopping every small bleeder, making sure nothing would rebleed after he closed. He inspected the cavity from every angle, checked and rechecked, because this was the part where rushing led to complications, where missing A small bleeder meant the patient waking up with a hematoma that would undo everything. At 9 hours and 18 minutes after the first incision, Robert closed the dura. The resident helped place the bone flap back, secured it with titanium plates. Robert closed the muscle, the skin, placed the final suture. The anesthesiologist began the emergence sequence. Robert stepped back from the table, pulled off his gloves, untied his gown. His hands were shaking now, not from fear but from exhaustion. From 9 hours of holding instruments at angles that required constant micro-adjustments, from the sustained concentration that had allowed no room for distraction. The chief resident looked at him with something close to awe. That was incredible. Robert did not respond. He was watching Thomas, watching for the first signs of movement, the first indication that the brain was waking up from anesthesia. It came slowly, a twitch in the fingers, a change in breathing pattern, then the eyes opening, unfocused at first, then tracking. His anesthesiologist leaned down, spoke clearly. "Mr. Anderson, can you hear me?" Thomas blinked once, twice. His mouth moved. A sound came out, rough, uncertain. Yes. One word, but it was the right word, pronounced correctly, understood completely. The language centers were intact. Robert felt something release in his chest. Tension he had been holding for 9 hours. Maybe for 8 years. Maybe longer. He walked out of the OR, still in his scrub cap, still in his mask pulled down around his neck. Elizabeth stood when she saw him. She crossed the waiting room and stopped in front of him, searching his face for an answer. Robert nodded once. Unhurried, not performed. Just the truth. Simple and final. Elizabeth nodded back, and behind her, Kenneth exhaled so completely he had to put a hand on the wall. Thomas woke fully, 3 hours later in the recovery room. The tremor in his left hand had reduced by half. His speech was clear, if slow. When the neurologist asked him to name the objects she pointed to, he named them all. Pen, clock, watch. When she asked him to repeat a sentence, he repeated it exactly. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. When she asked him what year it was, he told her without hesitation. The neurologist documented everything, ran through the standard post-operative assessment protocol, and finally stepped back with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from seeing a case turn out better than anyone had predicted. She found Robert in the hallway and shook his hand. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've never seen a resection that clean in that location." Robert took the compliment, the way he took most things, with a brief nod and no additional comment. He was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from making decisions at the limit of precision for 9 consecutive hours. But underneath the tiredness was something else, something he had not felt in 8 years, which was the certainty that he had done the thing he was trained to do, and done it well. Elizabeth was allowed into the recovery room at 4. Thomas was awake, groggy, but present. She stood beside the bed and took his hand, the one without the IV, and held it without speaking. Thomas looked at her with clear eyes. Did it work? His voice was rough from the breathing tube, but the words came out in the right order, with the right meaning. And Elizabeth felt tears she had been holding for months finally break through. It worked. Thomas squeezed her hand, a weak pressure, but unmistakable. Then he closed his eyes and slept, the kind of sleep that was healing rather than escape. And Elizabeth sat beside him and did not move until the nurses told her visiting hours were over. The first week after surgery was a series of assessments. Physical therapy evaluated his motor function, found his left side slightly weaker than his right, but improving daily. Occupational therapy tested his ability to perform basic tasks, found no deficits. Speech therapy ran him through comprehension exercises, found his process speed slightly reduced, but well within normal range for someone his age. The pathology report came back on day 5. The tumor was a grade 2 astrocytoma, low grade, but with features suggesting it would progress to grade 3 within months. Complete resection had been achieved. Margins were clear. The oncologist reviewed the slides personally and told Elizabeth that her father would not need radiation, would not need chemotherapy, would need only monitoring, scans every 6 months to ensure nothing grew back. Robert visited Thomas every day that first week. Not as his surgeon, but as something else, something that did not have a professional category. They talked about the conference in Boston 12 years ago, about the conversation lasted 3 hours, about the questions Thomas had asked that no one else had asked, that no one else had thought to ask. You wanted to know what I'd do when my techniques got ahead of institutional support. Thomas, sitting up in bed now, able to walk to the bathroom unassisted, able to feed himself, nodded. You were developing approaches that required more time, more precision, more patience than the system was built to accommodate. I could see it frustrated you, the gap between what was possible and what was practical. Robert thought about that, about the years at Vanderbilt when he had been the surgeon. Everyone called for the difficult cases, the ones other people did not want because the risk was too high or the time required too long. About the pressure to move faster, to increase throughput, to treat surgery like a production line rather than an art that required however long it required. I walked away from it. After Linda died, I walked away from all of it because I couldn't separate the work from the failure. And for 8 years I told myself I was done, that I'd made my choice, that I was fine with it. He paused, looking at Thomas directly. Your daughter got stuck in the mud outside my house on the one night I happened to be home. If I'd been working late, if Joshua had been at a friend's house, if any of a dozen small things had been different, she would have driven past, and I would never have known she was looking for me. And I'd still be in Clover Ridge telling myself I was fine. Thomas listened to this without interrupting. Then he spoke, and his voice was clear, the tremor almost entirely gone. You think that was chance? I don't know what else to call it. I call it a door opening. Whether you walk through is always your choice. But doors open at specific times for specific reasons, and the question isn't why they opened. It's whether you're paying attention when they do. Robert had no answer for that. He sat with it, with the idea that the last 8 years had not been a departure from the life he was meant to live, but a detour that had led him back to it. And that Elizabeth getting lost in a storm had not been bad luck for her, but good fortune for both of them. By the end of the second week, Thomas was discharged. He went home to the apartment he kept in Chicago, a place he had barely lived in for the last 6 months, because the tremor had made it difficult to manage stairs, difficult to cook, difficult to do the small tasks that made living alone possible. Now he walked up the stairs without assistance. Now he made coffee in the morning without spilling. Now he read the newspaper and understood every word. Elizabeth hired a nurse to check on him daily, but Thomas dismissed her after 3 days, said he was fine, said he did not need monitoring, said he was 73 years old and had survived worse things than brain surgery and did not intend to spend his remaining years being treated like he might break. Robert returned to Tennessee at the end of the 3rd week. He had spent 21 days in Chicago, most of them in the hospital or the hotel room adjacent to it, and he was ready to see Joshua, ready to see his own kitchen, ready to return to a place where people did not know he had just done something remarkable and therefore did not treat him remarkably. Elizabeth drove him to the airport. They did not talk much during the drive. She had offered to have Kenneth arrange a car, but Robert had declined, and she had understood that he wanted the drive, wanted the time between the hospital and the departure gate to decompress, to transition back to being the man who lived in Clover Ridge rather than the man who had just saved her father's life. At the terminal, she put the car in park and turned to him. "Thank you doesn't cover it. I know that. But thank you anyway." Robert looked at her. At the exhaustion still visible in her face despite 3 weeks of her father improving, and understood that she had been carrying the weight of his illness far longer than the diagnosis, that she had been watching him decline and knowing it would end badly and having no power to change it. "You found me. That's the part that mattered. Everything else was just doing what I was trained to do." She shook her head. "You did what 4 teams of surgeons said couldn't be done. That's not training. That's something else." He did not argue. He got out of the car, retrieved his bag from the back seat, and walked into the terminal without looking back. The flight to Nashville was half empty. He sat by the window and watched Chicago fall away beneath him, the grid of streets and buildings, and the lake beyond, impossibly blue under the October sky. Joshua was waiting at the Nashville airport with Gloria. He saw his father come through the gate and ran to him, and Robert caught him and lifted him the way he had when Joshua was younger, before 8 years of doing it alone had made everything harder. Joshua wrapped his arms around his neck and held on, and Robert held him back, and Gloria stood off to the side, giving them space. On the drive back to Clover Ridge, Joshua talked nonstop about school, about the science project he was working on, about the soccer game his team had won while Robert was gone, about the Halloween decorations that had started appearing on houses up and down the. Robert listened and responded, and felt the particular relief that comes from being with someone who does not need you to be anything other than what you are. Gloria had kept the house. The bills were paid, the refrigerator stocked, the plants watered. She had done it without being asked, the way neighbors do in small towns, the way people take care of each other when they have known each other long enough that favors do not require accounting. That night, after Joshua was asleep, Robert sat on the front porch with a beer and looked at the road where 3 weeks ago a convoy of luxury vehicles had appeared like something out of a dream. The road was empty now, dark under the bare oaks, the kind of emptiness that felt like peace rather than absence. His phone rang. Elizabeth's name appeared on the screen. He answered. "You made it back." "I did." A pause, the sound of her breathing, the background noise of wherever she was calling from. "My father wants to ask you something." Not as a patient. As someone who has a reasonably good read on people after 73 years. Robert waited. Elizabeth's voice continued, and he could hear her father speaking in the background, could hear her relaying his words. "He wants to know if you'd consider coming back. Not to Chicago, not to anything that doesn't make sense for your life, but back to medicine, to the work. Because the world you walked away from is smaller without you in it, and he thinks you know that." Robert looked out at the empty road, at the yard he had been painting when Elizabeth arrived, at the house where he had built a life that was small and safe and entirely his own. He thought about the 9 hours in the operating room, about the way his hands had remembered what to do, about the feeling of removing the last piece of tumor and knowing Thomas would wake up whole. "I'm not ready to say yes to that." Elizabeth relayed this to her father. Robert heard Thomas's response, faint through the phone, and then Elizabeth came back. "He says he knows. He just wanted you to hear that the door exists." They talked for a few more minutes about logistics, about the follow-up appointments Thomas had scheduled, about the scans that would track his recovery. Then they said goodbye, and Robert sat with the phone in his hand and thought about doors, about the ones that close and the ones that open and the ones that remain available, whether you walk through them or not. 6 weeks after the surgery, Thomas called Robert directly. The scans had come back clean. No residual tumor, no swelling, no complications. The neurologist had cleared him to return to full activity. The tremor was gone. His speech was normal. His memory was intact. By every measure that mattered, he had been cured. "I'm going back to work next week. Part-time at first, but work nonetheless. Elizabeth thinks I'm rushing it, but I've spent 6 months being sick, and I'm done with it." Robert, standing in his kitchen in Clover Ridge with the phone pressed to his ear, smiled despite himself. "Listen to your daughter. She's usually right. She is. Which is why I'm calling you instead of her. I have a proposal." Robert waited. Thomas continued, his voice strong. No hesitation. The voice of a man who had built a company from nothing and knew how to make an ask. Ashby Medical Center is opening a new neurosurgery research wing. Funded, staffed, equipped with everything you'd need. We're looking for a director. Someone who can develop techniques without institutional pressure to rush. Someone who can train the next generation of surgeons to think the way you think, to see what others miss. 2 days a month in Chicago. The rest of your time is yours. You could stay in Tennessee, be with Joshua, live your life the way you want to live it. But 2 days a month, you'd be doing the work you were meant to do. Robert looked out the window at the yard, where Joshua was throwing a football to himself, running patterns against an imaginary defense. He thought about the last 6 weeks, about returning to Clover Ridge and slipping back into the rhythm of his life here, about the electrical jobs he had taken and completed with the same precision he brought to everything, about the quiet satisfaction of work that was simple and finite and required no part of him that he was not willing to give. But he also thought about the operating room, about the moment when the tumor had come free, about the chief resident's face when she said it was incredible, when she said it was about the way his hands had known what to do. even after 8 years of not doing it. I need time to think about it. Take all the time you need. The offer doesn't expire. They talked for a few more minutes, then ended the call. Robert went outside and threw the football with Joshua until the light failed, and they went inside for dinner. November came. The leaves fell from the oaks. The temperature dropped. Robert painted the rest of the fence, fixed the gutter that had been leaking since spring, replaced the cracked taillight on his truck. He took electrical jobs, billed for his time, deposited checks. He lived his life the way had lived it for 8 years, and it was fine. And he told himself it was enough. But at night, alone in his room after Joshua was asleep, he thought about Thomas's offer. About 2 days a month being enough to stay connected to the work without being consumed by it. About training residents the way he wished he had been trained, with patience and precision, and the understanding that surgery was not production but craft. About seeing patients, the other doctors said, were inoperable and finding the margins they had missed. He thought about it, and he did not decide, and the weeks passed. On a Saturday in late November, a plain dark blue sedan turned off the county road and pulled up in front of the house. No advance call, no Kenneth, no driver. Elizabeth turned off the engine and sat for a moment looking at the front yard. Robert was painting the fence, the sections he had missed in October. Joshua was helping, his brush loaded, too heavy so paint dripped onto the grass. Elizabeth got out of the car. Robert saw her, set down his brush, wiped his hands on a rag. Joshua looked up, recognized her from the photographs Robert had shown him, and waved. Elizabeth waved back, for she walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from the fence. I should have called. It's fine. Joshua, sensing the adults needed space, announced he was going inside for a snack and disappeared through the front door. Robert gestured toward the porch steps. They sat. The late November afternoon was still, the light thin and gold through the bare oaks. You didn't recognize me because it was too dark and too rainy. Robert looked at her, at the woman who had appeared on his porch, soaking wet and desperate, and tried to reconcile her with the woman sitting beside him now, composed and certain. I remember the clothes, folded on the bed. I thought about that the next morning, how careful you were, how you didn't want to be a burden. That was the only way I knew how to say thank you. I didn't want to wake you up. You'd already done more than I had any right to ask. They sat without speaking for a moment. A car passed on the road, slowed to look at the sedan parked in the driveway, then continued. Robert watched it go. My father asked if I thought you'd come back to medicine. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know, but I thought you would, eventually, because of the way you were in that operating room. It wasn't something you stopped being good at. It was something you stopped letting yourself have. Robert absorbed this, the directness of it, the way she had cut through to the thing he had been avoiding thinking about for 6 weeks. He stood up, went inside, came back with 2 mugs of coffee. He held one out. She took it. He sat back down. The screen door banged, and Joshua reappeared with an apple and a sleeve of crackers. He settled on the step between them and started describing something that had happened at school, a disagreement during recess that had resolved itself in a way he found deeply satisfying. Elizabeth listened. She did not check her phone. She sat with paint on the bottom of her boots and listen to an 8-year-old tell the story of his week. When Joshua finished and went back inside, Elizabeth turned to Robert. "I didn't come here to pressure you about my father's offer. I came because I wanted to see where you lived, the place you chose after everything else fell apart. I wanted to understand what you built here." Robert looked at the house, the yard, the road stretching away in both directions. "I built a place where I didn't have to be anything I wasn't ready to be. Where Joshua could grow up without his father being the surgeon who saved people or the surgeon who failed. Just his father. And now? Now I don't know. Your father's offer makes sense. 2 days a month I could do that without disrupting Joshua's life. I could stay here, keep this, and also have that. But I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if going back part-time is enough, or if it would just remind me of what I gave up and make me want more." Elizabeth set down her coffee mug and looked at him directly. "You saved my father's life. You did it because an 8-year-old reminded you that when someone's father is sick, you help. You didn't ask for money. You didn't ask for recognition. You just did the thing you were trained to do because it needed doing. That's not something you stopped being. That's who you are. And I think you know it." Robert did not respond immediately. He looked at the fence he had been painting, at the sections still bare, at the work that remained. Then he looked at Joshua through the window, at his son moving around the kitchen with the unself-conscious ease of someone who felt safe, who felt home. "I'll think about it." Elizabeth nodded. She stood, and Robert stood with her. They walked to her car. She opened the door, paused. "My father's doing well, better than well. He's back at work 3 days a week. He's planning a trip to see my sister in California next month. He has his life back because you saw something 4 other teams missed. I just thought you should know that." "I'm glad." She got in the car, started the engine. Robert stepped back. She pulled away down the dirt road, and he watched until the car disappeared around the curve. And then he stood in the driveway alone and thought about what she had said, about the operating room, about the way his hands had remembered, about the door that remained open whether he walked through it or not. December came. Robert called Thomas and accepted the offer. 2 days a month, he would fly to Chicago and work at the Ashby Medical Center research wing. He would review cases, consult on difficult surgeries, teach residents the approaches he had developed. The rest of his time was his own. He would stay in Clover Ridge. Joshua would stay in his school. Their life would remain largely unchanged, except for 2 days a month when Robert would remember what it felt like to be a surgeon. The first trip was scheduled for January. Robert flew to Chicago on a Tuesday morning, worked Wednesday and Thursday, flew home Thursday night. He reviewed 3 cases, consulted on 2 surgeries, spent 4 hours teaching a group of residents how to identify margins in imaging that conventional reading would miss. He came home exhausted but satisfied, the kind of tired that came from using his mind at full capacity rather than parceling it out in small doses. Joshua asked how it went, and Robert said it went well, and Joshua nodded as if he had never doubted it, and they ate dinner and did homework and went to bed. February brought another trip. March brought another. By April, the pattern was established. 2 days in Chicago, the rest in Tennessee. Robert found he could hold both lives without either one diminishing the other. He could be the surgeon who developed new techniques and the father who helped with science projects. He could be the man who saved lives and the man who painted fences. He was not choosing between them. He was allowing himself to be both. In May, Elizabeth visited again. She came alone, drove the same blue sedan, parked in the same spot. This time, Robert was not painting. He was sitting on the porch with a book, and Joshua was in the yard with a friend from school, and the afternoon was warm with the particular softness of spring. Elizabeth sat beside him without asking. They watched the boys play. After a while, she spoke. "My father wants to set up a scholarship fund, in your wife's name, for medical students who show promise in neurosurgery but lack the financial means. He wants to call it the Linda Williams Memorial Scholarship." Robert set down his book and looked at her. "Why?" "Because you gave him his life back. And because he knows you did it not for him, but because it was the right thing to do. And he wants to make sure that kind of medicine continues. The kind that sees patients as people. The kind that takes the time to look when everyone else has stopped looking." Robert thought about Linda, about the conference she had driven him to, about the kiss at the curb, about the call that had come 3 weeks later. He thought about the 8 years he had spent running from her memory and the 9 hours in an operating room that had finally allowed him to separate the man who had failed to save her from the man who had saved Thomas. "Tell your father yes, and thank you." They sat in the afternoon warmth and did not speak. Joshua and his friend chased each other across the yard. The road was empty. The world was ordinary and small, and exactly as it should be. In June, the Ashby Medical Center sells a ceremony for the scholarship fund. Robert flew to Chicago with Joshua. They stayed 2 nights. Thomas gave a speech about the importance of supporting young physicians who thought differently, who pushed boundaries, who refused to accept inoperable as a final answer. He did not mention Robert by name, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. Afterward, at the reception, a young woman approached Robert. She was a second-year resident at the center, had attended one of his teaching sessions in March, had learned from him how to read imaging for margins others missed. She told him she had just been assigned her first solo case, a patient everyone else had declined, and she wanted to know if he would review the scans. Robert said yes. He spent an hour with her going through the imaging, showing her what to look for, explaining the approach he would take. She listened with the intensity of someone who understood she was learning something that could not be found in textbooks. When they finished, she thanked him, and he told her she would do fine, and he believed it. On the flight home, Joshua asked if Robert liked being a doctor again. Robert thought about the question, about the word again, about whether he had ever stopped being a doctor or had only stopped practicing. "I like helping people. I always have. I just forgot for a while that there were different ways to do it." Joshua considered this with his particular seriousness. "I'm glad you remembered." "Me too, buddy." The plane descended into Nashville. The wheels touched down. They drove home through the summer evening, windows down, warm air flowing through the truck. The road to Clover Ridge was familiar, every turn and rise memorized by repetition, and Robert felt something he had not felt in 8 years, which was gratitude, not for what he had lost, but for what remained. For the son besides, for the work he was allowed to do, for the life he had built and the life he was rebuilding, and for the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of healing is allowing yourself to be healed.